Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. We are starting off the next overview presentation. My name is Ann Ty Bennett. I'm the other Deputy Director in DRL's Office of Global Programs. I'm here with our Grants Office colleague.
My name is Karen Field. I work for AQM. For those of you who don't know, I actually work for the Bureau of Administration, and when offices and bureaus in the Department of State don't have internal grants making authority, they come to the A Bureau to process their grants. So I work almost exclusively on DRL grants, as do a lot of my colleagues who are here for the working lunch. So AQM means Acquisitions Management. So if you didn't know that acronym before, so we're the grants officers. We're the ones that sign the grant, do the final negotiation, and have the authority to actually issue the money at the end of the whole lovely process that we will go through.
And our office, our program teams work very closely with our grants officers, and so it's really, we work hand in hand during the sort of pre-award and implementation oversight period of grants for DRL. So we'll get started. Let's see, our overview first, sort of broadly, DRL programs support 4 broad pillars: respect for and protection of fundamental human rights, inclusive political processes that reflect the will of the people, accountable and effective institutions of government under rule of law, and civil societies, including non-governmental organizations, and a free press. So these are sort of the broad buckets of DRL's focus of our programs, and I think they're fairly self-explanatory, and they're pretty all-encompassing in terms of anything policy-wise that DRL would be interested in that we would then support programming in. Broadly as well, we support U.S. foreign policy objectives as identified under each administration, secretary, and when we have one, an assistant secretary for the Bureau. And our programs are global. We cover every region in the world and a broad range of thematic issues that also encompass some emergency response programs. And we have just a list of some of the examples of the programmatic themes that we program towards, because this is also, these are policy focus areas as well for the Bureau. So this is not fully holistic of everything that we cover from the thematic space, but it gives you an idea. And this is how our funding has grown in the since DRL started programming in fiscal year 2000. This shows up through what we just awarded out, which was fiscal year 16 money. Fiscal year 17 we don't have showing on here yet, but you can see our funding pot has grown substantially since we started programming in essentially around 2000, and we will continue to expect some pretty robust programming for the current and coming fiscal years. So our programs are overseen, and sort of contact points for DRL programs are the grants officer representatives, which are the GORs, and program officers serve as your primary grantee contacts for regional and thematic programs. So the GORs and program officers sit with DRL GP, so they are within our office on our program team, and work very closely with the grants officers in AQM. Karen is one of, we have five grants officers who we work closely with from AQM. And since 1998, our office has obligated approximately $1 billion worth of foreign assistance since 1998. And we currently are managing over 400 open grants.
So when you look at the grant agreements that you may have gotten issued if you are current grantees, it will tell you, usually there's one page that says roles and responsibility. It will identify the grants officer, the program officer, and the GOR. Sometimes the GOR and the program officer are the same, sometimes it's different. So those are your primary points of contact. When you deal with the grants office, we always need the grant number because we don't have as close day-to-day contact with you guys. So we need the grant number that will let us go into our systems and pull up that specific grant to see what the issue is, and hopefully give you a really detailed answer to whatever the question may be.
And just to further explain it, as this is outlined in the grant agreements, and usually also in the kickoff calls, we explain that the GORs and program officers from my office are sort of your subject matter experts, technical experts about the programs, about the themes that we're covering.
And then a formal authority and approvals always come from the grants office. So this is kind of a life cycle and stakeholders. You've heard from some of these people today, DRL, budget. You have the grants officers, the applicants, and the payment systems. Some of you most of the grants are paid through our payment management system. A few are paid through a manual system called a 270. All of that is identified in the grant. The life cycle for grants is the pre-award, which is the notice of funding opportunity, the whole panel process, everything that happens in advance of the award, then the issuance of the award. Post-award is all the implementation stuff. And then at some point, we actually like to close out grants. We don't do it as effectively as one would like, but we actually like that idea. And these are all the systems that we are now using. Most of it all is electronic if you're getting a US-based grant. Grant Solutions, which will become SAM's Domestic now in about a month, will go in a blackout period and transition to SAM Domestic, and they'll be presenting after us. PMS is your payment management system, and then we have internal financial systems, and then grants.gov is where where most of the open competitions are posted, so that you can apply either through grants.gov, or you should be able to apply through the new Grant Solutions system, the SAM's Domestic.
I guess I'll go through the overview of our solicitation process. Our solicitation starts with a notice of funding opportunity, and actually before we even get to posting a NOFA, we at DRL determine the sort of priorities for what we will program against, and that is done. I think I have other slides that sort of go through how we come to those priorities. Then our office designs the notice of funding opportunity and posts that. And that sort of starts the application process. So the notice of funding opportunity goes out to potential applicants, who will then look through all of the guidance and the statement on what we're looking for, submit in your application, sort of per all the requirements and what's noted in our proposal submission instructions. And then once that comes to us by the deadline on the DRL end, we download all the applications, review them for technical eligibility, and then review them on the sort of substance and how well they address the NOFA. And there's a full panel process of multiple offices within state, and it's an interagency panel that reviews the proposals. We have very deep sort of debate and dialogue at our panels on each proposal's merits and the criteria, whether they've met the criteria. Review that, and then usually make a recommendation forward to the DRL front office that the assistant secretary and sort of formally decide which ones will be ultimately funded and then put forward to AQM to process. And then we'll go through sort of timeline, life cycle tips. So these are just the outlines of, I guess, all the details that I'll be going into on each of these sections.
Yes,
so that's just sort of a quick overview of these next 5 points. So number 1, how do we come to our priorities for programming? So in the scheme of things, we have very limited foreign assistance funding for this type of work. And with limited funds, we have to really narrow down what are the priorities for programming. And ultimately, those have to come from, what are DRL's policy priorities that we need to focus on as the State Department under sort of administration priorities under DRL's mandate. So our policy colleagues who you heard from, some of our policy colleagues you heard from in the thematic panel, which my co-deputy Claire had moderated, talked about, these are what our policy issues, policy focus areas are. So we work very closely and tag team with our policy counterparts to look at, okay, what are DRL's policy priorities for the upcoming year or couple of years, and then we can work together with them to narrow down what is programmable, what do we want to program in support of furthering those policy goals. And we come to those policy goals based on sort of information from country narrative reports and our State Department human rights reports and other outside-based evidence reports, priorities that might be specifically identified by the President, Secretary of State, the sort of State Department generally, and DRL specifically, and we coordinate closely with other agencies and other donors, so even outside USG donors who we might work in similar space with. So there is a lot of interagency discussion as well as outside donor discussion to sort of make sure that we are doing complementary work in a space where other donors are also working. Do you want to do this one?
So in the application process, DRL allocates the foreign assistance. Almost all of the grants are open competed, and we do that the NOFA, because we have to have acronyms, Notice of Funding Opportunity. So, and those you will find on grants.gov is where they're all posted. So there was a question during the working lunch about, how do you access the new grants that are, or opportunities that come up. You can set up your account on grants.gov. I'm sure that you can set up alerts for the different agencies or different funding priorities so that you can be notified if something is posted, so then you can go and look to see if it fits what your programming niche is. There are some programs in DRL that they do what we call SOIs, Statement of Interests, which are abbreviated proposals. It will be very limited, and they'll panel those. And from that broader competition, they'll winnow it down to a smaller number. They'll ask for all of the full proposal. So there are several teams that do that based on historically getting a lot of initial grants in. And so it can limit the burden on organizations, so you can just do a shorter version of it. And then you'll be notified if the panel has put you forward. There are some sensitive programs that we also may do a limited competition. You would only be notified if we're going to ask you to apply to those ones as well. But also, when you look at the solicitation and kind of talked about it, you will not be deemed technically eligible if you miss something. They ask for very specific things to be included in your full proposal. If you don't have that risk assessment, or you don't have that audit or something else that was required, you can be deemed technically ineligible. And that has happened. So be very clear on what both the NOFA is asking for, and then DRL has a supplemental packet that goes with it. It is the program submission instructions. Make sure you're reading that. It always surprises me also that some organizations, the solicitation closes at 11:59, and we will get emails every single year going, oh, it's 12:01, it uploaded at 12:01. You're out. If you're waiting that close to the end mark and there was a glitch, we can't accept it. It has to be in by that end date and time.
And just to note too, DRL does not accept unsolicited applications. We have a NOFA, whether it's limited or public, in terms of openly competed. We solicit for for proposals. So I know sometimes, occasionally, someone will send in to us an unsolicited proposal, and we're always referring people to, keep your eyes open for the notice of funding opportunities, because we have a very set cycle.
Here's probably some of it. And also, if we also do not accept non-electronic submissions. If you are having technical issues and the PSI says this, you need to open a help desk ticket with grants.gov, and that can allow us to negotiate with you if it's a technical issue. But a lot of times grantees are applying and they actually go to the DRL program person and not the help desk. So you need to make sure you're going to the right people to help you if you're having technical issues uploading something, and have that on file, because that will be my first question if I'm asked, hey, this organization is having or had difficulties uploading something, and my first question will be, where's the help desk ticket? When was it logged? Who are they working with? And then I can follow up to see if we're going to allow it. This is some other information. So December 8th is when we'll be hopefully integrated to SAM's Domestic, and the SAM's Domestic team will speak to that. There'll be changes on how we can't then take applications through the current grant solution systems. It will be grants.gov or SAM's Domestic. And then you can also see the link to the DRL website. They usually also, all the funding opportunities are there that are open at that point. I just talked about, no, we can't give you assistance with grants.gov or Grant Solutions, nor will we be able to help you with the new grants, SAM's domestic. You have to open a help desk ticket. All solicitations usually go out pending availability of funds. So that's all then dependent on the funds being congressionally notified and the funds are available to actually issue at the end of the fiscal year.
And sorry, just because we do get a lot of questions from applicants on, well, can you help me with Grant Solutions? What do you see on grants.gov? We actually don't have any additional insight into the interface. So we actually we don't have any technical capability on our end to actually see anything different and be helpful in any way whatsoever. So just emphasizing, it's really important if you do hit a technical glitch when you're submitting an application to go straight to the help desk for the relevant site.
Go ahead. Is this going to be available?
Oh, this, I believe so.
I think we're going to, I see people taking some photos of these. It's fine. I believe we're going to make these available to you as well, so that, you can also hopefully get access to the whole PowerPoint. Here are some important instructions, especially for those organizations that are not based in the US. There's a requirement that your application has to be in English. And that means that, if you get a letter of support from an organization you're going to work with in that country, we should have an English translation. It needs to be in US dollars. These are reasons that you will have trouble when you get to the grant side if these things aren't there. And ensure that all those documents are uploaded as required and that they uploaded correctly. That would be something also, is that you've uploaded it, but did it take? We have had organizations where you go in and they're like, well, we uploaded it, but that file is empty, or it actually didn't upload correctly, or I think we've even had one where they put when they were uploading it, how if you put something on the printer wrong, it prints blank pages. Make sure that all of your files are actually there before you hit that final button. Who's eligible to apply? Really, foreign non-governmental agencies, foreign public agencies. These used to be the PIOs. We had to change the acronym because, just because we had to.
The PIO stood for Public International Organization. So it's the same type of entity. We just now have a different acronym for them at the State Department.
And then college, universities, and not-for-profits in the United States. In some limited basis, we will also accept applicants for for-profits, but there are limits to what a for-profit, you basically can't make profit off of a grant. So there are some limitations to what a for-profit can do and some other oversight that's given for a for-profit.
And I'd say those conditions are very specifically laid out in the 2 CFR 200 if there is a for-profit entity that is potentially interested in applying, because there's very specific parameters around that.
So it's pretty open on who can apply, and it's also then said in the NOFA who can apply. You just need to make sure that on your 424 that you're identifying the type of entity correctly, because that is a legal binding document. So if you've identified yourself as a 501 or a nonprofit and you're not, that could be, we could deem you technically ineligible for that and not be able to review the project.
So tips for a good proposal. So I've been on the side of writing many proposals. I led a program team within my office. Now I sort of have this broader view as a deputy. So proposal writing is critical to this group as you are considering applying for any DRL programs that we NOFA for. So it really starts with the quality of the program idea, which means it must be responsive to the solicitation. So read the Notice of Funding Opportunity very carefully and closely, and it really must respond to what we are seeking to program. And our solicitations are a little broader. Certainly, we're not as prescriptive as, say, USAID. but you still must be able to address what are the objectives and goals that we're trying to look to achieve with our programming, and look at the specific things that we've written in. It's usually 1-2 paragraphs on the substantive program side that we're looking for in terms of quality of your program idea. And it must be appropriate for the operating environment. We program in many different types of operating environments around the world, some, many of which are quite sensitive or extremely difficult, so be very thoughtful about the operating environment. Presumably most applicants that are applying into our different programs already have some area of experience in that particular operating environment. And we are very interested in innovative, creative programs. I think DRL's original genesis for programming came from the idea of trying to be a kind of incubator of innovative ideas, more of a venture capital type approach to US government programming globally in this particular space of democracy, human rights, and labor. So innovation is key. How you interpret that, innovation doesn't just automatically mean technology in our space. We're talking about different approaches, creative approaches, particularly given the tough environments where you all are operating in. Being innovative is very critical to sort of the survival of the type of work you're doing and the groups that we're all trying to support. So the quality of the program idea is really first and foremost what we're looking at. Second, and I do believe all of these tips in terms of these categories, we actually write very specifically into our PSIs, proposal submission instructions, so you can sort of remind yourself of these different categories as you're going through that. Second area is the program planning and ability to achieve objectives. Making sure you can really articulate the link between your project activities and the objectives, clearly defined work plan with a timeline, identifying stakeholders and local partners where applicable and appropriate, where possible, that is helpful. Inclusion of marginalized populations in terms of, really integrating various, threatened groups into sort of as a sort of mainstreaming of marginalized populations. A risk assessment is now required for all proposals. This is a new requirement that's also very specifically outlined in our PSIs now, and security and contingency plans if they're requested in the NOFA. Unfortunately, given the current environment in a lot of these places, this is an increasing need and increasingly required in our NOFAs. So those are very critical. And we actually do review every document, every aspect of the proposal package. Next one. Multiplier effect and sustainability is another important category. We want to see you demonstrate the project's lasting effect beyond the direct beneficiaries and the life of the grant. We're always asking, so what? So what after 2 years, 3 years of a program, or a year, depending on the lifespan of the program that you're proposing or that we're able to fund? The important part for us is what happens next, particularly in this space of work that we're all working in. None of this is short-term impact. We won't see the impact of any of this work for years to come. So really thinking through what are the next steps after DRL funding ceases to ensure that there is some type of sustainability to what you're trying to do. I think from the donor side, we're always saying, our best case is we put ourselves out of work ultimately when it comes to U.S. foreign assistance. It should be really thinking through how does this work continue without U.S. government support. So really think through what that looks like for your programs. And the program monitoring and evaluation plan, and this is very much a focus under 2 CFR 200. We're looking for good outcome indicators with baselines and targets, and our in-house M&E expert, Giovanni Dazzo, is doing a presentation later today. So he'll speak more to this M&E point in particular.
The M&E point also is an element that can become a grant clause where we'll ask you to work with DRL's M&E specialist after the fact. So there are parts here that if it's not exactly where it needs to be, that we will continue to work with the organization to make sure that we're getting the right information and that the right things are being measured. But it's also an M&E plan. I think that Giovanni will say this. It's not a I wrote it at the beginning and now it's stagnant. This is a living document, and that you just need to have good communication with DRL as implementation starts, and like, oh, I thought I was going to have this indicator and actually realize that that's not the right indicator, and have that negotiation so that we're getting we're measuring the right things and getting the good information out.
I think the next slide we're looking at is, let's see,
sorry.
reach down, that's okay. I think the other section in proposal is the institution's record and capacity. So we want to see, you as an applicant, you have a proven track record in this space, either in this country or comparable context. It's really important to us that you have the capacity and track record to deliver such a project, that you have sufficient resources and experience. And then lastly, we do look at cost effectiveness, that you want to ensure that you have overall reasonable costs, sound budgeting, a detailed budget narrative, really explaining how you came to your cost estimates. I've had many conversations with applicants about what goes into a detailed budget narrative, and explaining, well, how did you come up with $2,000 for X category, really breaking it out in terms of per unit. What was the metric for determining that rate? Was it a market analysis? Was it historical cost? But you're literally spelling out in just text language what your Excel budget is showing.
So on the, so a couple things here. On the proven track record, for those organizations who've not previously worked with DRL, that doesn't mean that you can't. We actually give grants every single year to organizations we've never worked with before, or DRL's never worked with before, or AQM. So you just need to make the cases you may be new to this bureau, but you have experience in the field in that country, and spell it out. In terms of budgets, I always feel like a broken record, because I say this at every implementers conference, and I say this at every bidders conference. You need to write budget narratives as if it's budget narrative for dummies. Especially at the end of the fiscal year. In the last quarter of the government's fiscal year, AQM is processing 2/3 of all the grants it will process for the entire year, and actually most of that's happening in the last 4 to 6 weeks. So we work at the speed of bureaucracy until the end of the fiscal year, and then we're running like maniacs. We are always, all the grants officers, we're working weekends, evenings. It's not uncommon to work, I think in the last 2 weeks of this last fiscal year, I worked 80 hours to get all the money out. We also then sent out emails to organizations that we still had pending awards with, saying somebody needs to be available on Saturday, because we may be issuing grants at the nth hour on the last day of the fiscal year. And guess what, folks? In this fiscal year, the last day is Sunday. So and we will let you know that if we need you to be available to sign that grant, because when we issue the grant, it's not only that we've signed it, but that you've signed it, and it's usually by a certain time on that last day. So if you don't have clear explanations of how you came up with those budgetary numbers, we will come back to you and ask questions. And sometimes I have written emails with 20, 25 questions. How did you get that? Do you know that this number didn't match up? You told me that 2 + 2 = 6. Actually, I don't think it does. So proof your budgets. Don't depend on Excel to do it for you, because if you have an internal fault in your Excel document, it will carry through the entire grant and the entire budget. So really tell us how you came up with those numbers. Your budget narrative shouldn't just be a reiteration of the budget, saying that we have 10 participants coming for 10 days and it's $100 a day in per diem. It should be that we have 10 participants coming, and we've done the research, we've done this kind of program before, or we know that that's what the price of the ticket is because we've done the market research. So let us know how you came up with those numbers. I hate dartboard budgets, and dartboard budgets is saying we're going to do this great training, and it's $10,000. Okay, that's nice. How did you come up with $10,000? How do I know that's the right number? So give us the background and give us the details. Grants officers, we are not the subject matter experts in these areas, so we need to know where you've come up with your numbers. And if the reason is like, I've done this training 2 years ago, and that's how much it costs, it gives us an idea that at least you're at the right price point, or notionally there. So I say this every year. I, again, will get budgets narratives this year, as will my colleagues, that will say, salaries are for salaries and travel's for travel. And that's the narrative. That's not the care and feeding of your grants officer. And we like to sign things that we understand how the money goes out. So then you'll get questions like, don't understand, please give me more. Budget narratives for dummies.
It's really coming, explaining your rationale. And often on the program side, if you get to the point, if you're lucky enough to be negotiating with DRL and AQM on a prospective grant, the program team will triage in advance and try at the best. I mean, we're not budget experts on our side, but we do have enough basic understanding of what the grants officers are looking for that the program officers will typically come to the applicant first and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing in your budget. I think our grants office is going to have some issues with this. Please provide additional XYZ information. It behooves you as an applicant to be responsive to what the program team is asking for first, because we are predicting what the grants officer is going to come back with, and it will save everyone a lot of headache down the road, given the tight timing towards the last quarter of the fiscal year, to sort of have everything sort of smoothed out as much as possible before we pass it off to the grants office team. So just really keep that in mind, that when the program team's asking these kinds of questions, it's because we have an eye towards knowing where the grants officers are going to have issues. So,
Paneling and review.
We went over this a little bit. The DRL in the grants office, we determine if the technical requirements are met to determine whether or not the application is technically eligible. Then the applications are reviewed by an interagency panel, and the panel has a very thorough debate and vote on every single proposal, and we look at each proposal on its own merits. And that during that panel review process is when the interagency panel comes up with conditions and recommendations that applicant must meet or should meet in order to make it through a final negotiation with us. We put all of our panel recommendations then into a memo where we present it to the DRL Assistant Secretary to make the final determination on which awards we will issue, or at least giving that final Assistant Secretary imprimatur on this is what the DRL Assistant Secretary will deem will be a new grant, whatnot. But the final issuance of the award will then depend on clearances, number of clearances. So congressional notification has to go up and be approved by Congress, so we have to get the congressional authority. It's all dependent on the DRL Assistant Secretary's funding decisions, the availability of the funds, as Karen mentioned, and ultimately the grants office, so the grants officer makes the final review and ultimate determination and issues the grant itself. So the grants officer is doing that last round of negotiation, focus very heavily, particularly on the sort of budget and whether this is all rational, and then the actual final amount for the grant will be dependent upon that grants officer negotiation, and then gets issued from the grants office, and then you accept it from them. So AQM issues our grants on behalf of DRL.
So one of the things is that if you've not worked with DRL before, even if you have worked with another agency in the Department of State or USAID and you've got a PMS account, you need to have a PMS account that's also linked to DRL. So you need to tell us, we try to do DRL actually tries to do its due diligence to make sure that that's in place, but it also is in your best interest to let DRL know early. A lot of these things takes time to establish. We had a lot of really kind of out there, crazy, end of the fiscal year issues this year. We had SAM.gov, the CCR, that you have to have a CCR registration that's current. We had a couple of organizations that had what I would call mixed incorporations. One level it told me it was incorporated in this country, and another level it said it was incorporated in that country. All of those things take time to fix, so it really behooves you to make sure that your information in all of the electronic systems are clean and pristine, and that you have the right information there. I had literally 2 grantees this year that had incorporation issues or name changes, that they changed the name and it only got changed at one level in the system and not the other level. Well, that's a problem. That's an administrative problem that ultimately and unfortunately usually isn't caught till the end. And then we're in a mad rush to get it fixed because, again, we're trying to get all these grants out in the last 4 to 6 weeks before the system's shut down and we lose the money. So try to do your due diligence to make sure that as much as you can, know that your electronic records are where they need to be, and ask questions. If a grants officer reaches out to you and says, I see this as a problem, I had an organization I did that with, and I asked them to do certain steps, and we had a phone call 3 weeks later, and they're like, well, we didn't do that because we thought we already had that. And I'm like, and yet you don't. And now we're in a panic. So luckily we didn't lose grants this year, but that certainly could have created a problem where we can't issue a grant based on some of those issues.
And I'll just say all of what we just covered is sort of part of the reason why it takes so long for DRL, U.S. government, to issue new awards. I always wondered when I was on the implementer end why it basically took a whole year. Well, there are many, many layers of review on sort of substance, on technical issues, negotiating with all various stakeholders across the interagency. And then when there are technical issues that the grants office runs into, it is a very long process. So typically what we can tell everyone always wants to know, well, when's, if you've been approved for a new award, people want to know, when is that grant going to be issued? The only certainty we can ever have is it will be issued before the last day of the fiscal year. So things that we're NOFOing now or over the course of the next couple months, all we really know is that any awards that come out of that will be issued and must be co-signed by September 30th, 2018. So that is the time frame. And I think on the next slide, I think you're going to go over the grants life cycle.
I actually just also want to point out that knowing what we've just said is that think about that in terms of your own processes. We had some grantees that we were trying to negotiate, and they had key staff on travel. And luckily, those key staff we could reach. But in some cases, we've had oh, well, so-and-so is on travel, and nobody else is here, and we'll try to reach them. That's not what we need to hear when we have 5 days left in the fiscal year. So just know that make sure that you have your key staff available for these final negotiations, and signatories, whoever's going to sign it is available during during the month of September, and at a minimum during the last 2 weeks, because we can't issue a grant if we don't have our questions answered and we're clear on the terms of the agreements. So the life cycle of the grant, we've kind of done these things again, but this is, again, a lot of processes. Pre-award, we issue the NOFA or the statement of interest. Both of those are paneled. If you are chosen from a statement of interest and submit a full proposal, those full proposals are paneled again. So there's many steps here. And then based on the outcome of the panel, you may have a letter of negotiation where the panel has asked questions, they have recommendations, they have conditions that spelled out about what they'd like to see maybe tweaked in the proposal as submitted. If you noted on the previous slides, working with marginalized populations is a weighted factor. They may come back and say, we'd like you to also expand your minority outreach to this segment as well. What isn't a weighted factor for DRL is cost share. So we look for cost effectiveness, but it doesn't mean cost share. If you put cost share in your budget, it makes it no more competitive than another that didn't, but it will be a legally binding and administratively element of the grant if you have cost share. So if you don't know, you have to deal with cost share as if it's federal money. So if you have cost share and you have salaries and other things, you need timesheets, you need invoices, you need all the other stuff as if it's USG money. So I actually was a Peace Corps volunteer, so I'm actually like cost share because it shows commitment, but there are reasons not to have it. And you can also informally note in a program report that you actually have cost share, it's just not a legally binding requirement. Then when we go into the award, this is where you're establishing the payment system if you don't have a PMS account. You will see if you've not worked with DRL or Department of State before, when we send out the NOFA, it will talk about establishing an account in which will become Sam's Domestic so that you can apply and have communications through that system. That can take a while. Do not wait. So anything in the NOFA that says we encourage you to start establishing this account now, they actually mean that. It's not just because they thought that sounded good. It's really do it now. And then if it's issued, once it's reviewed and hopefully it's approvable by the grants office, we will issue the grant. Post-war communication, DRL and AQM are doing a lot of kickoff calls on almost all grants where we will set up a phone call or in-person conversation with the grantees to talk about the administrative part of the grant and the communication streams. We do both, and then the program side. The administrative part isn't the fun, sexy part of this process, but it is your foundational pieces. So we want to make sure that somebody in the organization knows what the grant agreement says. We go through it. We talk issues. I am a big proponent of grants as an area to ask questions and not forgiveness, because there may be something that we actually can't forgive. And then we maybe have to disallow costs or take a punitive approach. So it's very important that we have really transparent, clear communication, not only with your grants officer, but with your program officer. And then that's also when we talk about the drawdowns and the reporting that is required in the grant. All of it's spelled out in the grant agreement, but we go through that and make sure everybody's on the same page about when things are due and how they should be submitted. And then again, in the hopes that we actually get to close out your grant someday, we have a whole closeout process that you submit your final reports. If you have a NICRA, negotiated integrated cost agreement with the U.S. government, the new regulations gives you 12 months to finalize that rate. Otherwise, we will close out on the provisional rate unless you have a predetermined rate, which allows us to close it out immediately. And then once you get that final notification of closeout, you need to retain your records for 3 years. And that's all spelled out in the 2 CFR 200, which hopefully you all know intimately and love and have bookmarked on your computer. And it's just such a wonderful document.
I'll go through the timeline next. Our NOFAs have different deadlines for different regions' themes. Hopefully some of you met our program officers, program teams in my office, GP. We have different teams covering each region, covering the different global themes that we program to. So the deadlines are all different because it's all sort of team dependent. So NOFAs are starting to get posted for us, so you keep an eye open on grants.gov. Grant Solutions, I guess we're still using up until November 6th, so we are posting some things to there. But over the course of the next few months, you're going to see quite a few NOFAs get posted. So this is generally the season. Just keep monitoring these sites. After December 8th, the solicitations will be posted on SAM's Domestic and grants.gov, and the SAM's Domestic team will be here doing their presentation after this. And as we talked about, all new awards will be issued by September 30th, 2018.
So I've kind of alluded to this. Set up your accounts early on grants.gov, and it will be the SAM's Domestic. You can set up alerts for new solicitation. We will be transitioning, DRL should be live by December 8th on the new system. So when SAM's Domestic comes up, please make sure that you know you ask the questions you need to know so you have your account set up and you're ready to go when that comes back up. And then you have to have a unique identifier number, which was formerly called DUNS, and we don't call it DUNS, but it's still DUNS. And you have to have an active sam.gov/CCR registration. So make sure that that system is up to date. If that system, it has to be active through the entire life of your grant. So if it expires, or if it's going to expire like in October, and we're issuing a grant in September, it's probably in your best interest to make sure you've updated that before a new grant is issued, because we may ask you, where are you in process with that? And then you just make sure that your reporting is timely, transparent, and communicate with DRL. If there is issues. A lot of these areas we work in, or DRL works in, there are delays in programming. We can do no-cost extensions, but it's because of delays in programming, not because of money. So just have good communication if you're running into delays or need to brainstorm some solutions with DRL or with AQM if there's things that we can chime in on.
And I always say because quarterly reports are so delayed by the time we see them, since they're submitted, if you're lucky enough to either be a current grantee or in the future you become a grantee, you'll have quarterly reporting. Those deadlines are hard and fast. We have no ability to give extensions on quarterly reports. If something is going to be late, let us know, because we appreciate knowing that, but we have no ability to give any extensions. These are firm deadlines, but we do not want to find out big piece of news in a quarterly report. We are a donor that really wants to work collaboratively with you and help you problem solve in advance of a problem. So if there is going to be an issue, please tell the program officer or team in advance, or if it's something that really needs the grants officer to be involved with right away. We would rather know sooner rather than later. We do not want to find out about big issues in a quarterly report because it's OBE by the time we see it in a report. So please think of us as collaborators. We have excellent program officers and GORs who really know their subject areas, really know the regions, and we want to help you figure out how to implement your programs. And because these are all challenging environments in which we work, we never expect anything to just go smoothly. That would not be a DRL program given the type of work we're supporting. These are very complicated environments and not easy topics to be addressing. So thank you to you as organizations doing this very difficult work, and know that we are here as a partner to help support that. And if there is a potential problem, please tell us in advance.
That's actually true of administrative problems. Don't let us find out that we had an organization that let us find out that they had a defalcation, which is embezzlement, in their audit. Do you think they're doing business with us anymore? No. If you suspect fraud in a program, in a subrecipient or anything, give us a heads up or contact the OIG yourself. That's actually a mandatory reporting requirement. But again, you build trust with us by being transparent. We're not going to ding you because things went wrong necessarily. We want to try to, again, work with you to see what's happening. But we do have to, if we're notified that there might be fraud, waste, or abuse, we have a mandatory reporting requirement if you haven't notified the OIG. So, and then we would be monitoring the situation to see what kind of investigation you guys did. So administrative problems as well, you need to just please be transparent with us, and we can be a partner to help you try to figure out the best ways to mitigate and come up with some ways. Ultimately the final determination is the grants officer on certain costs, but it's good to just have good transparent communication. And unfortunately, this is an area that you might have a sub in a country that there is the potential for fraud. We've had it, we'll have it in the future. So then it also becomes part of your risk assessment of how do you maybe mitigate the risk of that happening. But again, transparent communication is really important with AQM as well as DRL.
And we have very transparent communication, so it's very much a close-knit team. So we are now on to the Q&A section. So if anyone has questions, I guess come up to one of the mics and we'll do our best to answer your question. Just remember to introduce yourself.
It's really cold.
Hello, this is Afrindaka from Madre. Thank you so much for all your tips and important information. I had a couple of questions about. One is about the fixed amount awards, of how does it work when applying, and also what terms of financial supporting documents is required when implementation is taking place. And also about the vetting process. For example, are the people identified in the key personnel document only vetted, or is it also the participants? Thank you.
Which vetting are you talking about? There's so many.
Oh, the vetting process when applying, or basically submitting a full proposal, and you get awarded, and there's a vetting process.
So generally, we're checking the CCR at the organizational level. Rarely there are some countries that we have to do further vetting, but that would be identified, we'd identify that up front. Syria is RAM vetting, risk analysis management, and that would be part of the NOFA, that we would actually vet that then at the individuals. And actually in Syria, it's also participant level vetting.
But if you're just talking about vetting where as we're reviewing key personnel that you're proposing in the proposal, we're just looking to make sure that makes sense. There are sort of formal vetting processes for certain programs. But if you end up getting an award from us with certain key personnel listed and those personnel changed, you have to notify the grants officer, preferably in advance of the change. Notify the grants officer.
And that's actually an approval process. It's not just a notification process, and that is because in the past we have had somebody who get a grant and the person managing has 10 years experience and they leave, and then the organization comes to us and say, hey, we want to put this person's going to manage the grant, and they've been there 6 months, and it's a multi-million-dollar grant. No. You don't get a 10-year person and a 6-month person. So that is an actual approval process that you need actual approval from the grants office. But know that when I or my colleagues approve key personnel shift, we're doing that collaboratively with our GPU colleagues. We're saying, what do you think? They may come and say, we're fine with it, and then we'll look, and I'm like, well, I don't see how this experience matches this, and we may come back and just ask some questions. For FAAs, fixed amount awards, for those who don't know that acronym. So fixed amount awards, you can issue up to $150,000 to a subrecipient. So the subrecipient full amount has to be $150,000 or less. It is a deliverable model. So instead of having a detailed budget that we would approve with salaries and travel and fringe and other direct costs and supplies, et cetera, you would have a deliverable that, this organization is going to do 5 trainings for us, and you have the first deliverable, maybe the signing of the agreement, and you have a tranche of money that goes to them, and then you would list out what are their deliverables and what is the proof of deliverable. Is it a report? Is it a training agenda? Is it proof that it happened? So if you know that you want to do an FAA, but you haven't sussed all of that out yet, you can put in the prime budget that a grants officer would approve that you plan to do an FAA, and you kind of have a price point placeholder, and it's kind of a to-be-decided follow-up, in which case there's a standard term in the grant agreement saying that any subaward budget that is not fully approved at the time of execution, you'd have to come back to us and submit then the scope of works and the budgets. And in an FAA, they're kind of one document. Now, I think it's a best practice, if you're going to issue an FAA, that you have your sub submit to you that full detailed budget so that you understand where they're coming up with their prices. It's kind of like, and I always date myself, if those that are old and decrepit, name that tune. I can name that tune for 4 notes, but if they take 5 notes to name that tune, you only owe them 4. If they name that tune in 3 notes, you owe them 4. So you have to be clear on where the money is coming from so that hopefully you're not overpaying or underpaying your subrecipient. It is fixed. So I think it's a best practice for you as the primes to have that detailed budget, but then you translate it into an FAA modality, which is based on a deliverable schedule. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Rihanna Hartmink. I'm with PAX, and first of all, I'd like to thank you for organizing this day, and it was very nice to see this joint presentation, very insightful, so thanks for your time. And then I have a question, if you could perhaps elaborate a little bit more on the selection of priorities and how the design process works. Who is involved in this? Is it just DRL, or is it broader within the department, or maybe even outside it? And how are different priorities weighed against one another? Because we heard this morning there's so many different issues that DRL works on in so many regions that how is it all weighed against each other? It seems like a very interesting challenge. And a brief question, a little bit referring to the previous questioner, is I heard some talk about slightly stricter vetting for maybe partners on the ground. Is there any truth to that? That was coming in DRL grants perhaps in the coming year or so.
Maybe we'll start with that one and work backwards.
So there are some vettings, in particular the RAM vetting, that is more, right now I believe it's only Syria that is participant specific. And that would be on the ground. There are other vettings. If you Leahy vetting would be one. If you're dealing with police or military, that's kind of a more on the ground vetting. That would be articulated either in the NOFA, that this kind of vetting will be applicable to the awards that we're looking at, and then reiterated again in the grant agreement. If the NOFA doesn't say that this kind of level of vetting is going to be applicable, it probably isn't, and I say probably because at the time the NOFA was submitted and published, maybe something changed, and then we would have that discussion. DRL would probably start that discussion off with the organizations during the negotiation process, and then AQM would follow it up with the clauses in the grant agreement. So
It's very specific
yeah.
to just particular countries, and with Leahy too, it would be notified in the NOFO itself if there's a particular type of vetting that's
So you're
required.
not expecting any new incoming regulations as far as you can tell right now?
expecting, no.
Yeah. And then as for sort of how does DRL come up with its priorities? I mean, it is pretty much a year-long, 1+ year-long process in working with our policy counterparts. I mean, it really starts with, at the administration level, at the highest levels, what are the administration's policy priorities in broad categories. Then as a bureau, we're looking at, with all of our policy office counterparts, if you don't really understand how DRL is broken down as a bureau, we are the Office of Global Programming that does all the programs for all of DRL. And then we have specific policy offices that are part of the bureau. So we have regional policy offices in DRL, as well as thematic policy offices, or the themes get folded into certain offices. And we tag team very closely with them. We go through a whole policy prioritization exercise that our policy counterparts design with our front office in terms of what are DRL's policy priorities in the current context or for the coming year within the current administration's priorities. I mean, these are the overlays of priorities are, challenging to figure out, but DRL as a bureau has a certain mandate in terms of what we're looking at. We are legislatively mandated. There are certain topics and certain areas that we will always focus on broadly. And then within that is where we might, depending on the administration's priorities, look at how that all meshes. So there's this entire exercise where we work closely with our DRL policy counterparts and see how those policy priorities are laid out in each region per theme, sort of tiering them. Then we come up with sort of potential program interventions that we would solicit for in terms of what can we program towards to further those policy priorities. We come up with those ideas also while talking to AID, other donors, knowing sort of what the landscape is of other USG funding in comparable space. We talk to our regional bureau counterparts. We work very closely with the regional bureaus and embassies and consulates around the world. Our colleagues out at Post are very critical to the work we do. So there's a lot of coordination and discussion across the State Department and with USAID. So in terms of interagency, certainly most of our coordination and conversation is happening with USAID, but there are multiple other US government agencies that we're talking to as well, I mean, DOJ, anyone who might be doing foreign assistance that could overlap with our space. And then we have lots of conversations with other big donors that are doing human rights, democracy work, whether in, you know, other like-minded governments or, you know, private donors as well. So there is a lot of conversation and cross-collaboration so that we know what we're doing is not redundant, but also can be complementary to other U.S. government efforts. So when you're talking about those priorities, it's looking at sort of various levels of sort of analysis, understanding what, you know, from the highest levels on down, what we're prioritizing in the policy space, and then we sort of figure out the programming landscape. We're not actually weighing priorities against each other. We have sort of have it divvied out enough so that each kind of major policy priority, major regional priority area gets addressed by our programs. Don't know if that is terribly helpful. If you want more specifics, or, you know, we can have additional conversations, but it's and it sort of changes a bit year to year.
Maybe it would be possible to sort of give an indication, because you have certain earmarked funding, right, for specific themes and areas, and then I assume there's a freer amount of funding available. As you said, it's divvied up. Could you say something about how that's more or less divvied up, or does it differ per year a lot?
I mean, there is a lot of earmark. If you look at the appropriations language in the appropriations bill, we have earmarks within our Human Rights Democracy Fund, which is our core pot of money that DRL uses. There are ESF earmarks, which are the bilateral accounts. So, you know, in terms of the appropriations bill, we have an ESF earmark that comes directly to DRL for forensic assistance. We have, you know, the earmark for internet freedom that's earmarked on the Democracy Fund, as well as ESF. We have International Religious Freedom Programming earmarked. So in terms of what's hard earmarked by Congress, you can see that pretty clearly, that if you were to scour through. So clearly those numbers are obvious because those are put into law for us. The rest is kind of divvied out. You know, we try to make sure every region gets funding to program towards DRL policy priorities. And then global themes, you know, we have the Labor Office, we have within MLGA, there are a number of different issues that we cover from the policy perspective. We also have, you know, the IRF Office, of course, but they get the IRF earmark. We have a number of global thematics that I might be spacing out on right now.
It's on the website, though.
It's all, I think we listed out on the website in terms of what currently we're looking at thematically. We do try to hit every area, just depending on the year, depending on the funding, what Congress is telling us to do.